Today's subject is rather controversial, and I know there are a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding this one. So, while I might be mentioning a couple of things that might be kind of controversial, keep in mind what the main theme of today's subject is. It is not necessarily about all of the conspiracy theories, it is about the prison break of one man that inspired an entire marathon. Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary have a way of swallowing sound. Men have disappeared there before. Moonshiners, runaways, drunks, hunters. Probably a few people nobody ever reported missing because the relatives were secretly maybe a little relieved. But in June of 1977, the prison sat in those Tennessee hills like a concrete infection jammed into the wilderness. Razor wire, guns, towers, concrete walls stained by rain and time and maybe a few other things. The sort of place where hope went to die slowly. And on the night of June 10th, 7 convicts slipped out of that prison and vanished into the surrounding mountains. One of them was James Earl Ray. Now, if you were alive in 1977, hearing the name on the radio probably made your stomach tighten up a little bit. Some names do that. Some names stop being just names and become shadows. James Earl Ray was already one of the most hated men in America. He was convicted for assassinating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. nearly a decade earlier. People didn't just think of him as being a criminal. They thought of him as a wound. He was a national wound with a face attached to it. And suddenly he was loose again. You can imagine the panic. Prison guards screamed into their radios, bloodhounds barking themselves hoarse, helicopters grinding through the skies overhead, local families locking their doors that they normally left open at night, at least back then. Men loading shotguns they had not cleaned since deer season 3 years earlier. Somewhere in those woods was a convicted assassin who had already proven that he could disappear. He'd already done it before. And that was the thing about James Earl Ray. He was not some criminal mastermind. This man was not charming. He wasn't brilliant. He wasn't particularly impressive to look at. He was the human equivalent of a cigarette burn on an old couch. He's easy to overlook until you realize the whole house smelled like smoke, and you're trying to figure out the source. Well, history happens that way sometimes, not with thunder and not with kings and not with great speeches. Sometimes history happens because a nervous little man keeps slipping through the cracks everyone else has done a diligent job of ignoring. James Earl Ray had been slipping through the cracks most of his life. He was born in 1928 in Alton, Illinois, into a family already wobbling under bad luck, bad choices, bad timing. His father passed a fraudulent check and fled town. The family even changed their last name for a while to avoid the law, which honestly feels like something out of a cheap desperation story from the Depression-era crime serials. Young James quit school at the age of 12. 12. At an age when most boys are still trying to figure out multiplication tables and whether frogs explode if you throw them hard enough against a barn wall. Yes, that is something he did. Ray was already drifting toward crime, too. He joined the army near the end of World War II, but military life rejected him like a bad organ transplant. Records described him as lacking adaptability and inept. That's a rough thing to have written about you permanently. Imagine failing so badly that the government essentially says, please leave immediately before you somehow lose a tank. My brother left the military in not quite as bad as circumstances, but almost. That's a story for another day. After that came the robberies, the burglaries, the scams, the prisons, and eventually the escape. Because James Earl Ray escaping prison in 1967 sounds almost funny if you say it too fast. He hid inside a bread truck, leaving the Missouri State Penitentiary bakery with bread. America spent years hunting one of its most infamous fugitives because a man crawled out alongside loaves of bread like some criminal version of a grocery delivery. You couldn't make this stuff up. In fact, this story has inspired a few different movie plots. But it gets stranger. After escaping, Ray drifted across America and Canada like a man trying on different lives at a department store. St. Louis, Chicago, Toronto, Montreal, Birmingham, Mexico, California. He bought a white Mustang with cash under a fake name. He carried forged documents. He read newspapers obsessively, and he followed politics. He became fascinated with George Wallace's presidential campaign. At one point, he took bartending lessons. He took dance lessons, too. That part always gets me. Somewhere out there in late 1967, James Earl Ray was learning ballroom dancing while one of the biggest manhunts in America was being built in the distance like a thunderstorm nobody could hear yet. They were looking for him, and he's out there two-stepping. And then there was Mexico. Good Lord, Mexico. Because while hiding there under the alias of Eric Starvo Galt, Ray decided he wanted to become a pornographic filmmaker. Now, I want you to imagine the level of confidence required for something like this. There was a prison escape with no filmmaking experience, no directing experience, no visible charisma. Apparently, the emotional warmth of a parking meter who was suddenly deciding, yeah, adult cinema is clearly my destiny. What? Well, he ordered camera equipment through the mail. He filmed local sex workers. He tried building a little operation for himself, and it failed spectacularly. Of course it did. The whole thing feels less like the life of an assassin and more like the fever dream of a man unraveling one terrible idea at a time. Maybe he was hit on the head a little too hard as a child. But then came 1968, and the drifting stopped. Ray traveled to Atlanta. There he bought some maps. He circled locations tied to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He drove to Birmingham and purchased a Remington rifle with a scope. These have been verified facts. Later on, he followed King's movements through newspapers. Every step suddenly became colder and more focused, more deliberate. And then came Memphis, April 4th of 1968. The Lorraine Motel. 6:05 in the evening. One shot, one rifle crack that tore through the American history like an axe through old floorboards. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. collapsed on the balcony outside of room 306. Panic erupted immediately, of course. People screamed and pointed, and people ran, and somewhere nearby, according to investigators, James Earl Ray fled, carrying the terrible weight of what he had just done. Except this is where the story begins getting kind of slippery, because Ray confessed. Then he recanted. Then he blamed a mysterious man named Raoul. Who's Raoul? And suddenly, the case became kind of swampy and murky. Was this somebody he worked with during his pornography years down in Mexico? But this swamp became kind of deep, kind where every step sinks you in a little further. Some believed that Ray acted alone. Some believed he was manipulated. Some believed that there was a larger conspiracy involving organized crime or government agencies or political extremists. Well, Dr. King's own family later on questioned whether Ray had truly fired the shot himself. Dexter King met James Earl Ray personally in prison and publicly stated that he believed Ray's claims of innocence. This is getting kind of deep. As my father would say when I was a child, save the watches. It's getting deep in here. Imagine carrying that around with you. Imagine being the man convicted of one of the most important assassinations in American history, while even the victim's own family doubts the official story. It sounds less like reality and more like the plot of a nightmare where nobody can agree who opened the door and let the monster in. And then came the escape at Brushy Mountain. By 1977, James Earl Ray had spent years inside prison walls. But prisons have rhythms, weaknesses, and patterns. Men study guards the way wolves study fences and the habits of sheep. On June 10th, Ray and 6 others slipped away into the mountains. For 3 days, they hid in rough wilderness country full of snakes and cliffs and briars and thick forest. Those hills are no joke. I've spent a little time in them myself. They can break experienced hikers. They can turn direction upside down. There are places out there where sunlight barely touches the ground and every tree looks exactly like the last one. They're so deep in the woods you have to pipe the sunshine in. The search explored and exploded across Tennessee. There were roadblocks. They used dogs and helicopters, armed patrols. And the newspapers, of course, ate it up, as newspapers always do. America could not resist a fugitive story, especially this fugitive story. The convicted killer of Martin Luther King Jr. loose in the wilderness again. It practically wrote itself. Of course they're going to eat this up. And here's the strange little twist that nobody ever sees coming. That failed prison escape eventually inspired one of the hardest races on Earth, called the Barkley Marathons. A brutal ultramarathon through some of those same Tennessee mountains. 100 miles of suffering through steep wilderness, thorns, darkness, exhaustion, hallucinations, and misery. The race founder supposedly looked at the how little ground Ray covered during those 3 days before he was recaptured and joked that he thought he could do it better. Well, now athletes crawl through those hills, half delirious and vomiting and bleeding and crying and quitting and occasionally talking to trees like the trees are their best friend or like they owe them money. But hey, that's America for you. Home of the free, land of the brave. We can turn literally anything into a sporting event. I've seen that happen before too. It's crazy. But Ray and the others were recaptured on June 13th. They were dirty and exhausted and finished. An extra year, and that's all, got added to his sentence, bringing it to an even 100 years. That's why they only added 1 year. But prison did not stop the arguments surrounding this man. Books appeared and interviews appeared and conspiracy theories multiplied like flies around roadkill. Ray insisted that he was set up. His attorney pushed theories involving shadowy accomplices. And who was this Raoul? A civil jury in 1999 concluded that there may indeed have been a broader conspiracy surrounding King's death. And then the United States Department of Justice rejected those conclusions. Back and forth, back and forth. The truth became like a tennis ball getting smacked across a net that nobody could even see anymore. Nobody has all the facts anymore. And maybe the strangest part of it is this. James Earl Ray never really stopped being useful to people, especially to the conspiracy theorists, to the journalists, to the politicians, to the publishers, to the filmmakers, to anyone looking for answers or profit or attention, or all three. 10 years after Ray died, his brother, John Larry Ray, co-authored a book claiming to reveal, quote, the real truth behind the assassination. But by then, James Earl Ray was gone. He died in 1998 from complications tied to hepatitis C and kidney disease after nearly 3 decades behind bars. Yeah, he only served a third of his sentence. So what are we left with? Well, there's a dead civil rights leader. There's a dead convicted assassin. There's a prison escape, a rifle, a passport, a mystery. and enough unanswered questions to keep bookstores and businesses for another century. That's the other thing about certain moments in history. They do not end cleanly. They don't wrap themselves up like tidy little detective novels with a bow. They linger, they rot, they spread like mold in the walls, like cigarette smoke in the curtains, like guilt in a quiet room at 3 o'clock in the morning. Somewhere in another universe, maybe James Earl Ray stayed inside prison after hiding in the bread truck. Maybe Martin Luther King Jr. lived longer. Maybe history bent another direction entirely. But here we have the version where a drifting criminal crossed borders, changed names, escaped prisons, sparked conspiracies, and left behind one of the deepest scars in modern American history. And all these years later, people are still standing around and arguing over this scar, over who held the knife. So here's the question. I know it wasn't a knife. I know it was actually a gun, but I'm speaking metaphorically. So here's the question I want to leave you with today. Do you think America will ever fully uncover the truth behind the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Or has the real story been buried too deeply beneath fear and politics and time? It never really be uncovered. I know this is going to be controversial. I'm ready for it. Bring it. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, because I've got more coming at you tomorrow. And make sure you subscribe to the podcast wherever you get podcasts so you never miss an episode. Every subscriber helps. And you know how I love hearing from you guys. So I'll see you tomorrow.